In 1953, three chemists in San Diego tried to stop a missile from rusting, and by accident made something now sitting in nearly every American garage. Number 7 was the trick your grandfather used for free, long before this can was created. Number 3 was once pulled from a war zone for a reason the company never explained. Here is the truth. This was never built for your garage. It was a military secret that escaped, and the company spent decades hiding the real story. Hit subscribe. Let's count down the 10 forgotten secrets behind WD-40, the company never wanted on the can. Number 10. The Atlas Missile Coating. Before WD-40 ever touched a hinge or a bicycle chain, your grandfather's generation watched rockets stand on launch pads, and nobody outside 3 rooms in San Diego knew that those same rockets were quietly rusting from the inside out. In 1953, the outer skin of the Atlas missile was made from steel that corroded fast enough to threaten the entire Cold War missile program. A team of chemists at a small company called Rocket Chemical Company spent months testing formula after formula, failure after failure, while engineers stood by watching, knowing the missile could be useless before it ever left the ground. The trick wasn't strength, it was displacement, pushing water itself off the metal so rust had nothing to grip onto. The chemists built early test batches in nothing more than oversized lab beakers, brushing the mixture directly onto raw missile panels by hand. If you wanted to recreate the basic principle at home today without buying a can, an old rag soaked in plain mineral oil and wiped over bare metal does almost the same displacing job for the price of a bottle from the hardware store. The Department of Defense classified the entire project, and for years the only people who knew this formula existed were men with security clearances and a missile to protect. We now know the formula worked so well that it outlived the missile program itself by 70 years. Somewhere, a grandfather who helped build that missile by hand never got to tell his own grandkids what was actually sitting in the can in their garage. Number 9. The name on the can. Your great-grandmother never asked what the letters WD-40 actually stood for. She just knew the can worked, sitting on a shelf next to the motor oil in a garage that smelled permanently of gasoline and sawdust. The truth behind the name was simple and almost comically blunt. Water displacement, 40th formula. 39 attempts failed before a chemist finally landed on a mixture that worked, and the company never bothered renaming it for something catchier because there was no marketing department yet to insist on it. The trick was in the number itself, not a secret code, but an honest record of failure after failure until something finally stuck. There was no fancy lab equipment involved, just repeated mixing, testing on real metal, and starting over. If you wanted your own version of that same trial and error problem solving today, the cheapest version is exactly what those chemists did. Write down every failed attempt on paper instead of throwing the notes away, because attempt number 40 almost never happens without attempts 1 through 39 sitting right in front of you. Rocket Chemical Company itself is the culprit here, oddly enough, refusing for decades to publish the full ingredient list, turning a blunt, honest name into something that sounded like a secret formula instead of 40 rounds of someone simply trying again. We now know the recipe was never glamorous, just stubborn. Somewhere, a great-grandmother kept using a product for 30 years without ever knowing it was named after somebody else's persistence, not magic. Number 8. The Convair lunchbox leak. Long before a single can sat on a hardware store shelf, your grandfather's co-workers were already sneaking the formula out of the missile factory in their lunch pails. Convair, the aerospace company building the Atlas missile in San Diego, used the spray to protect missile parts on the assembly line, and employees noticed it worked just as well on squeaky hinges, rusted bike chains, and stuck fishing reels at home. By the mid-1950s, workers were filling small personal containers straight from the factory supply before clocking out, years before the public ever heard the name WD-40. The technique was simple enough that nobody needed instructions. Spray it directly on the rusted joint, let it sit for a minute, then work the metal loose by hand. Factory supervisors eventually noticed entire drums disappearing faster than the missile production schedule could explain. If you wanted the same homemade version of borrowed industrial supply, the modern budget equivalent is simply buying a single shared family-sized can rather than 5 individual ones, the same instinct that made factory workers split a single drum among an entire shift. Convair's own management is the culprit, having tried for over a year to stop employees from taking spray home before finally giving up and letting the company sell it commercially instead. We now know that Decision built an entire industry by accident, born from men who just wanted their garage tools to stop sticking. Somewhere, a grandfather's old lunch pail still smells faintly of solvent, decades after he stopped working the line. Number 7. The home mixed penetrating oil. Before any of this existed in a can, your grandfather kept a small jar on his workbench filled with a mixture he made himself, usually a blend of plain motor oil and kerosene, sometimes a splash of turpentine, stirred with a stick he kept just for that purpose. He used it on rusted bolts, stuck hinges, and frozen bicycle chains for free in a garage lit by a single bare bulb, decades before anyone could simply walk into a store and buy the same result in aerosol form. The trick was the kerosene. It thinned the oil enough to creep into tiny gaps in rusted metal that thick oil alone couldn't reach. Exactly the same principle modern penetrating sprays use today. He built his mixture from leftovers already sitting in the garage, never spending a separate dime on it. You can still make a rough version today for under $2 by mixing 3 parts motor oil to 1 part kerosene in any old jar, instead of paying $5 or $6 for a fresh can. The petroleum additive industry is the culprit here, gradually replacing the open recipe everyone knew with a proprietary aerosol blend nobody outside the company could legally reproduce, turning a free kitchen table mixture into something you now have to repurchase every few months. We now know the basic chemistry was never complicated, just convenient. Somewhere, a grandfather's stained workbench jar sat empty for the first time in 30 years, the week his son brought home a spray can instead. Number 6. The door-to-door years. Before this product ever sat on a hardware store shelf, your grandmother's first encounter with WD-40 likely came from a traveling salesman standing on her porch, demonstration can in hand, spraying a rusted hinge right there on the doorstep to prove a point before asking for a sale. Through the late 1950s, the product wasn't distributed through retail chains at all. It moved almost entirely through small distributors and door-to-door demonstrations, sold one household at a time, often for around $2 a can. The selling trick was always the same: show, don't explain. Salesmen carried a rusted padlock or a stuck hinge specifically for the demonstration, spraying it in front of the customer and working it loose within seconds. A piece of theater that sold the product faster than any printed advertisement could. If you wanted the modern budget version of that same door-to-door persuasion today, it's simply testing a product yourself on the worst object in your house before buying it, rather than trusting the packaging. Major department store chains are the culprit in this part of the story. Many refuse to stock an unfamiliar aerosol can from a tiny San Diego chemical company for years, forcing it to grow person by person instead of shelf by shelf. We now know that slower door-to-door growth built a loyalty no advertising budget could buy. Somewhere, a grandmother still remembers the exact stranger on her porch who fixed her squeaky screen door for nothing more than the price of a small can. Number 5. The formula in the vault. Your great-grandfather's generation lived through decades where the most famous ingredient list in American garages was never written down anywhere a curious person could find it. Instead of filing a patent, which would have required publishing the exact formula for any competitor to read, the company chose to protect WD-40 as a trade secret, reportedly keeping the only handwritten copy of the original recipe locked inside an actual bank vault for over 60 years, known by only a small handful of employees at any given time. The trick wasn't chemical, it was legal. A patent expires and becomes public, but a trade secret can be protected indefinitely as long as nobody leaks it, and competitors spent decades trying to reverse engineer a formula from the outside instead of simply reading it. If you wanted to copy that same protective instinct at home for free, it's the same logic behind never writing your grandmother's recipe down in full, only passing it along by memory, person to person, so it never leaves the family. The company's own legal department is the culprit, deliberately choosing secrecy over the public patent system specifically so the formula could never legally expire. We now know that decision worked exactly as intended, since the full recipe still hasn't been confirmed publicly to this day. Somewhere, a great-grandfather used the same can for 40 years without ever knowing he was trusting a secret kept safer than most family heirlooms. Number 4. The multi-use myth. Your grandfather likely used a single can of this product for far more than rust, despite the label never officially recommending half of what people actually did with it: removing crayon from walls, freeing a stuck zipper, untangling a fishing line, even keeping wasps from building a nest under the porch eave. By the 1970s, customers were mailing the company letters describing dozens of unofficial household uses nobody in the lab had ever tested or approved. The trick was never advertised on purpose. The company kept its official claims narrow, limited mostly to lubrication and rust prevention, while the actual uses spread entirely through word of mouth between neighbors leaning over a fence. If you wanted the same multi-purpose mentality without buying a specialty product for each individual job, it is the simple habit of testing one general-purpose tool on a small new problem before assuming you need to buy something new entirely. The company's marketing department is the culprit here, deliberately keeping the printed claims modest for decades to avoid liability for uses they never tested in a lab, even while privately collecting thousands of customer letters describing exactly those uses. We now know the company eventually published an official long list of uses decades later, built almost entirely from ordinary people's letters rather than their own chemists. Somewhere, a grandfather's handwritten note about removing crayon from a wall sits in a filing cabinet at a company headquarters, never personally credited to him. Number 3. The War Zone Ban. During the Vietnam War, soldiers in your grandfather's unit reportedly sprayed their rifles with this same household formula to keep the moisture and grit of the jungle from jamming the moving parts, a habit that started informally and spread through entire platoons faster than any official supply order could keep up with. Soldiers wrote home asking family members to mail cans directly to their units, since standard military-issue lubricant wasn't holding up the same way in that climate. The trick worked because the same water-displacing formula built for a missile worked just as well on a rifle bolt soaked through by jungle rain, pushing moisture out of tight metal seams faster than oil alone could manage. If you wanted a rough budget alternative for protecting outdoor metal tools from the same kind of moisture today, a light coat of plain silicone spray from any hardware store does a similar, if less proven job for a few dollars. Military quartermaster supply commands are the culprit here, never officially approving the practice and quietly discouraging it through proper channels, even as soldiers kept doing it anyway because it worked better than what they were issued. We now know the unofficial practice became common enough that it shaped how later generations of soldiers were trained to maintain their weapons. Somewhere, a grandfather who came home from that war still keeps a can in his garage for reasons he never fully explains out loud. Number 2. The homebrew alternative nobody talks about. Long after WD-40 became a household name, your grandmother's generation of frugal homemakers still quietly mix their own version at the kitchen table, blending a small amount of vegetable oil with a few drops of dish soap and water in an old spray bottle, shaking it firm before spraying it onto a squeaky cabinet hinge instead of buying another can. It wasn't as strong, but it cost almost nothing and used items already sitting under the sink. The trick was emulsifying oil and water together just enough that the mixture could be sprayed evenly, even though oil and water naturally separate on their own within minutes if left sitting too long. She simply shook the bottle hard right before every single use to remix it instantly. You can build the same homemade version today for less than 50 cents in ingredients, instead of paying nearly $7 for a fresh can at the store. Big oil and chemical companies are the culprit here, lobbying for decades to keep cheap homemade alternatives out of mainstream advertising and household tip columns, framing anything mixed at home as inferior even when it solved the exact same small problem for pennies. We now know plenty of these home blends worked perfectly fine for light jobs the entire time. Somewhere, a grandmother's old spray bottle, refilled 100 times over 40 years, outlasted nearly every brand name can ever bought in that same house. Number 1. The can that almost stayed classified forever. If a handful of decisions in 1958 had gone differently, your grandfather might never have had a can of this product in his garage at all. For the first 5 years of its existence, WD-40 was used exclusively inside Convair's missile factory and never once offered for public sale, treated internally as nothing more than an industrial tool tied to a government missile contract. It only became a consumer product because employees kept asking to buy it for personal use again and again until the company finally relented. The trick that finally convinced the company was not a marketing plan. It was simple persistence. Workers requesting the same product for years until refusing to sell it publicly stopped making business sense. If you wanted to apply the same persistence to anything genuinely useful but unavailable to you today, it is asking the same direct, unglamorous question more than once instead of giving up after the first no. The U.S. defense contracting system itself was the culprit in this final piece, since secrecy tied to the government nearly kept a genuinely useful household product locked inside a single factory forever, simply because nobody outside that contract was ever supposed to need it. We now know that the almost classified can went on to outlast the missile program, the Cold War, and the company that first refused to sell it. Somewhere, a grandfather who once had to ask his own employer just to buy a can he helped use every day still keeps one within arm's reach in his garage, exactly where he always wanted it.